To start with, thanks everybody for being here. It's going to be cozy, if nothing else. As a further, like a small introduction, let me just say that this paper is indeed based on my dissertation and on the fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in West Belfast, in the nationalist sector of West Belfast, between 2010 and 2013. Approximately, and also partly on my MA work, again in West Belfast, although I was based in Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And I would like to thank my friend Dr. Sara Clavero, who's not here today, but give credit where credit is due. She is, I think, the first person who actually pointed out to me some of the contradictions that I think exist within the notion of empowerment. And as a further small introduction, let me just say that this paper has shifted a little in terms of what I originally had planned to talk about. And I've become sort of engrossed with the notion of empowerment, which obviously has to do with what I found in my fieldwork. And I thought I would focus particularly on that. So as I started working on the paper, I came up with an idea for an alternative title, which I haven't used, but I think it's worth mentioning perhaps. So it could have sounded something like, "What have the Troubles ever done for us?" and something like a subtitle saying "Women in West Belfast" or something like that. And this title would have allowed me to do two things. The first is make reference to a Monty Python film, which I think is always a good thing, and also to introduce the topic of the paper, I thought, quite nicely. So as many of you probably do know, the film that I'm referring to is Life of Brian, in which you have a character called Brian Cohen, which is quite funny in itself, who is born on the same day as Christ and is therefore mistaken for the Messiah, and a lot of chaos and mayhem is triggered by that misunderstanding. And I'm referring in particular to one scene, which you can see up there, in which the character played by John Cleese, who's the leader of an anti-Roman rebel / possibly terrorist, between brackets, organization, is asking his fellow organization members, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And of course that's a rhetorical question, because John Cleese is expecting everybody to sort of say, well, nothing. Obviously the Romans have never done anything good for us. However, someone in the audience raises his hand and says, well, the aqueduct. And I have a bit of a confusion there, because John Cleese has to acknowledge that, yes, okay, they did build the aqueduct, but apart from that, what have they ever done for us? And then someone else says sanitation, and then the roads and medicine. So there's a bit of a confusion there. And eventually, John Cleese is forced to say that, yes, they have done all that, they've built the roads, they've built the aqueduct, but apart from that, what have they ever done for us? So I thought that as a researcher, in a way, I found myself in a position similar to the one that John Cleese was in that scene. At the beginning of my fieldwork, I guess, when I started asking questions about the impact of the conflict or the troubles on women's lives, and I was expecting answers to be entirely in the negative. So I was expecting people to talk about the chaos and mayhem and loss of life that they experienced during the troubles, which of course was also talked about. But what surprised me in the beginning was that quite a few of the interviewees actually talked about the positive side effect, if you will, of the troubles. And they said that, and I'm talking mostly of female, almost exclusively female interviewees, they said that the conflict made them stronger and independent, more independent, and they were talking about themselves and what they perceived to be, more general situation for women in West Belfast. So the narrative that emerged quite consistently in the fieldwork was one of empowerment. So yes, given all the negative effects of the troubles, at least we became stronger, basically. And the reason why women became stronger and more independent, I was told, had to do with the fact that the large number of males, as we all know, were physically not present in the area anymore. So lots of working class areas in nationalist as well as unionist parts of the city were left almost entirely in the hands of women, and quite capable hands, as it turned out. So answers along this line came both from women who had been actively involved either in the armed struggle or in external support to the struggle, and from women who hadn't been involved in any way in the Republican movement. So my questions on the impact of the trouble didn't only trigger answers in the negative, and a narrative of empowerment emerged quite consistently from the fieldwork. And this empowerment was associated directly, as I say, with the absence of men. So as a researcher and as a feminist, I felt that my role went beyond that of a sort of a propaganda leader preparing to write a pamphlet on women's empowerment or the strength of women. And I thought it was my duty and also part of the fun of doing research to try and figure out what exactly the interviewees meant by notions of strength and independence and ultimately empowerment, and what kind of empowerment and what kind of agency seemed to emerge from their narratives. One of the risks I think that ethnographers particularly experience is to become so engrossed and enmeshed in the narratives that they and the worldviews that they encounter in the field as to sort of forget what should be the essential second part of the anthropological work, which is anthropological interpretation. And this is particularly true, I think, when the researcher has some sort of political affinity with the people that he or she is working with. And in that case, the step from listening to sort of full-on embracing can be quite short. And I think there are examples of this sometimes in the literature. So the risk is particularly acute when in places like Northern Ireland, where political ideology or political propaganda, depending on which way you want to look at it, is obviously quite powerful. So without denying the interviewee's sense of personal empowerment, I will try in this paper to highlight what I perceive to be some of the pitfalls of the notion of empowerment as it is used in this particular context, and as I will argue more generally in today's world. So the way I will go about doing this will be, first I will try to unpack the notions of empowerment and the associated notions of independence, responsibility, and agency that are explicitly or implicitly evoked in the narratives, and the associated ideas of what I would call extended mothering or community mothering, as it has been called. And in doing so, I will also mention the instances in which the participants' use and understanding of these words are somewhat in contrast with my own understanding of those words. Secondly, I will briefly look at the history of the notion of empowerment and how it tends to be interpreted in mainstream discourses in several areas today. And to conclude, I will suggest that the interviewee's ideas of empowerment are not dissimilar to the general idea that is in vogue in the current political and social climate, and try to suggest some of the pitfalls of this interpretation of empowerment. So basically asking the question, is empowerment a tool for change, or is it a concept, as some have suggested, in the service of the status quo? So basically a concept that leaves everything as it is, untouched. So the section of the paper that deals particularly with empowerment is the newest addition to my previous research. And basically what happens is that the fact that this concept is really omnipresent in our daily lives, from self-help, shelves in bookstores, to yoga-type meditations, to counseling, psychotherapy, feminism, you name it, it's there. This fact has been annoying me, I think, for some time, so I thought this was a good opportunity to look into it in some depth. So the paper has eventually embraced a broader reflection on the use of this word, although it's a tentative first reflection. So, as mentioned previously, the impact of the conflict on women's lives in West Belfast was quite consistently associated with ideas of empowerment. And some of the quotes from the fieldwork, I think, will illustrate this. Needless to say, of course, these are not the interviewees' real names, and the ages refer to the age at the time of interview. So, for example, Jessica said that the conflict made women very, very strong and independent. And it brought that element out because the majority of women would have had their husbands in jail. So they learned to manage the house on their own, they learned to make decisions on their own, and they learned to actually just live on their own. Diane says that at the start, meaning before the Troubles, the man dominated the woman. But when men got out of jail, the woman was strong. They were able to cope without the man. They were able to put a plug on something and change light bulbs and do all things around the house. They could do a lot of stuff. Alice says that the older women, which is the women who have gone through the Troubles here, are actually stronger and more able, because the conflict, the other side of it was that the conflict raised the assertiveness and the self-belief of women. The women here in their 40s and 50s are strong women, they're articulate, they're politicized, they're aware, etc. And Eleanor said, because the men were all lifted and put away, and maybe women realized they could get on with their life without a man. So the quotes could be multiplied, but I think these sort of give an idea of what we're talking about. So we are talking about strength, obviously. We're talking about ability, and ability is sort of the ability to cope with everything that life may put in your way. To an extent, we're talking about self-awareness and assertiveness as well, about politicization, which I think is something that we would find in women and men alike, of course. And we're talking implicitly or explicitly about independence, literally the ability to do things without needing anybody's help. So, for example, there are several references in the interviews to things like learning to keep track of the money that was being spent for the family or for the husband in prison, paying the bills, get public assistance when one was entitled to it, so that sort of thing. There was a certain insistence on practical things and an emphasis on the fact that before the Troubles, it would have been men who dealt with these things in the household. So, in that sense, anthropologically speaking, the Troubles were often depicted as a sort of rite of passage, which took women from a childlike state of dependency from a man or a male figure to full adulthood. And interestingly, from a feminist perspective, this maturation was described often in contrast with the state of dependency that, according to some of the interviews, characterized the previous generations of women, such as their mothers and grandmothers. So if we look at the notion of genealogies of women developed by Lucy Rigaret, in these narratives, the kind of genealogy that we find emphasizes often how dependent and sort of childlike the older generations of women would have been when compared to the women who went through the conflict. So, for example, Jessica here says what you did do before the conflict, you actually shifted from one man to another man, and she's referring to, from a father to a husband. The conflict made women very, very strong and independent. You sort of came out with the attitude, I'm not doing what my mommy done for my daddy. So that would be the basis of where you started coming from. I'm not doing that. And Roberta says, I think women toughened up more, so they have. Now they don't let people walk over them or anything, If a woman's got something to say, they'll say it now, so they will. And again, there's a difference is marked between the previous generation and the generation of women who were sort of forged through the Troubles. So in contrast to the women who went through the Troubles, one of the interviewees referred to the previous generation of women as to what she called the holy wee women of the falls, and that was including in this narrative her own mother. So she says, my mom was a very, very religious person, very compassionate person as well. She had absolutely no notion of the wider political scenario, not a political person at all. But she operated on the basis of human beings and was very simplistic, like what she wanted was peace, and she wanted to protect her children and her family. The biggest contribution that she would have made would have been, and she felt that that was a massive contribution, to go out and pray at the street corner. And of course, Julia is also talking from the point of view of someone who has become quite critical of the Catholic Church as an institution. And Anne says there was 9 in our family, and basically my mother was there to keep the house, which is understandable, I think. So these holy wee women of the falls, it was suggested, were dependent on men in terms of decision-making and practicalities, as well as financially, because some of them were, of course, in employment, but their salaries would not have been sufficient to cover all the family expenses. So the trouble placing women in a condition in which they couldn't but fend for themselves and take up the father and mother role, as it's often described, and become the only breadwinners of the household, also provided them with the awareness of their own self-worth and ability and strength. So the empowerment that they feel they gain from the conflict has to do with the ability to cope, again, another very common word these days, with anything that life may put in your way. So as Anne put it, talking about all the things that were happening during the Trouble, she says, there's a long list of things that were happening, but plus the British government, plus anything else they threw at us, and they threw a hell of a lot at us, you had to sort of brush yourself down and brace yourself and get on with it, because that's the only way you survived. To me, a conflict is the only way you do survive. You have to be strong because you have to get on with things. So those words there, brush yourself down, embrace yourself, and get on with it, kind of summarize the way it was, or it was described to me anyway. So in this scenario in which many men were actually physically absent, women had obviously to do everything. And as Diane put it, it was a woman shouldering everything, which I think is a very apt summary. So, for example, they talk about the fact that for the women who did have husbands or partners in jails, they felt it was impossible for them to communicate any problem they may have in their own family life, because the man was in jail, he was suffering so much already. There's no way you can burden him with anything else. And so, in this context, the answer that you can see at the bottom of the slide there, which I received from Tanya, becomes slightly less surprising. So we were talking about independent women in her own life, and she said, my mom is very independent, she does everything for my dad. And I don't know about you, but for me, the notion of independence doesn't immediately trigger the idea of doing everything for someone else. It's a bit of an unusual understanding of the word. It's worth mentioning that Tanya's father is disabled, so her mother is literally, he's unable to work, so her mother is the only person in the household who does work and has her own car and runs her own business. And apparently the entire family turns to her when they need advice, financial support, you name it. So she's a self-made woman who does everything for herself. Her parents, by the way, are also divorced. However, she keeps doing everything for her ex-husband, as Tanya put it. Now, my initial surprise when Tanya told me this sort of started to dissipate when I realized that, of course, she's right. I mean, literally, independence means you don't depend on anybody. So it suggests self-reliance. I don't actually need anybody else to do whatever I need to do. But in my mind, however, the word keeps being associated with some ideas of freedom, as opposed to the idea of actually doing something for someone else, or everything for someone else. Now, this difference between Tanya's understanding of the word independence, if you will, and my own, would remain anecdotal if it was in part and parcel of a broader gap in our understanding of things. And it's precisely this kind of gap, this conundrum, if you will, that which initially opens up, I think, to us the worldviews of the others, as you may call them. So, in the narratives, empowerment and independence, referring as they do to shouldering everything, are inextricably linked with a sense of responsibility for the well-being of one's own family as well as entire community. So, while there's not enough time to go through this with this particular paper, my suggestion is that women's mothering functions became extended to the entire community. And in my dissertation, I call this extended mothering. Others have called it activist mothering. So basically, the caring functions that mothers are expected to carry out towards their children, and the rest of the family as well, were extended here to the entire community. So in that sense, what did happen at times was that the boundary between private and public became blurred. So Francine, for example, who's a Sinn Féin representative, said that she was a very reluctant politician. She would have wanted to be involved only in community work, but she was sort of dragged into politics with a capital P. But she says it was the community stuff that I wanted to do, but I ended up being involved in politics. I prefer to do the community stuff, working in people's houses, talking to them. And to be honest, my home was open. My home was like a Sinn Féin center. So everybody could walk in and ask for help or advice. So in the sense, the community becomes part of what would normally be the family. As I was saying, Callie Persick was written about women in community work in West Belfast, called this activist mothering. So the psychological side of this is a heightened sense of responsibility towards one's family and one's community. And it was often pointed out to me that women who did experience prison usually felt it imperative upon release to, as one of them put it, get back into the swing of life, try and build into your own community, take care of your aging parents, as opposed to, I suppose, enjoying freedom. So as pointed out by Meredith Tax, awareness of others is indeed considered imperative for women. And interestingly, awareness of and caring for others were described in the interviews as the province of women and women alone. So a huge gap was described between what happens after release to men and women. And this is Jessica again, who says that when men are released, they're fascinated by the whole change in the world in the whole time that they've been in jail, and they don't want to come out of jail into a regime of home. I would say you do need to fly your kite, which I think is a brilliant expression. You do need to feel your freedom, a sense of freedom about yourself. You do need to feel that you started to taste the world again. And coming home to sort of get a job and hand the wages in and watch Coronation Street, and then she laughed and say, it's not really what you want to do. However, women never seem to be able to fly their kite, apparently. So while there is obviously a significant element of hero worshipping towards male ex-prisoners, which tends to get stronger the harder the prison experience was, there's also a sense in which they are regarded as little children in a way, and thus infantilized, at least in the first stages post-release. And the idea is, surely you don't expect a child or a 30-year-old who comes out of jail feeling like he's still 20, as they put it, to take on family responsibility right away. So there has to be a gap in which they get to enjoy their freedom. However, taking on responsibility seems to be what women do and are expected to do, which takes me directly to the issue of agency. So agency is a bit of a tricky concept to handle, because on the one hand, you wouldn't want to suggest that people are devoid of agency, but on the other hand, you would also like to be able to be honest as to the limitations that people's agency encounter, and also, and more importantly, about the way that the social agents themselves talk about their own agency in a given situation. And it's been noticed that the difficulty in dealing with agency is likely to increase for those of us who do research from a feminist point of view. So, as is indicated here, feminist theory and women's history have long grappled with the problem of documenting women's position as victims of their culturally subordinate status, while also celebrating women's strength and creativity in resisting that subordination. Now, I wouldn't necessarily use the word victim, but I think that gets the point across. So if one wants to avoid that type of feminist-oriented research that basically ends up being a celebration, purely a celebration of women's experiences, it's perhaps important to look at the way in which agency is discursively constructed in any given social context. So agency can be defined in a fairly basic way as the social actor's ability to make choices within the constraints of their social conditionings and material circumstances. So while some authors tend to emphasize the creative or imaginative nature of agency, others focus more on the social constraint. Judith Butler argues that the word agency refers not to voluntaristic choices, but to what she calls a reiterative, difficult word, practice, immanent to power. So reiteration of practices is quite important here. So when discussing how their lives changed after their partners were imprisoned, the interviewees tended to describe their acting in the world as the sort of inevitable byproduct of external circumstances, and of course of the choices made by others. So in the following extract here, Mary describes how her life changed, after her husband was imprisoned, and how she found herself sort of forced to look for full-time employment and engage in the routine of prison visits. And she says it wasn't even as a woman you were expected to, and she means to do certain things in a certain way. It was natural. So one day you're fine, the next day he's arrested, and then you just fell into the pattern then of your visits. So whatever was going on in your family life, you had to take on board because he was in jail, and that was the pattern. So on the one hand, she says it's natural. On the other hand, she says it's a pattern. So a pattern, the word pattern, of course, refers to a sort of pre-charted pathway which does exist already in the social and cultural scenario in which you find yourself. So the fact that women seem to suggest that they naturally followed a pattern which was already there. So what falling into the pattern actually meant on a practical level is again illustrated in the following extract in which Patty is describing her mother's life after several of her sons and daughters were imprisoned. So she said, as my daddy went to work, my mom was going to different jails. Sorry. She had 3 and 4 of us in at one time. So she was going in the minibus to one jail and then maybe not even going home, but maybe sit, have a cup of tea or soup, and then go back on a long journey to McGilligan Camp or along Cache. And that's the way it was. It was hard, but we didn't realize it at the time. It was like, well, the army's here and they've arrested everybody, and it was like a resistance of war, and you had to fight for your community. So she says, for years my mom was still going to jail, even in her 70s, and her heart was absolutely broken. Every mother you look, you can see the heartache in them. It's just a terrible thing. Even during my married life, you were always active because you were always going to jails. So this heavy burden placed on women's shoulders is part and parcel of what the Republican discourse or rhetoric, whichever way you want to look at it, refers to by the expression that women were the backbone of the struggle, which is an expression that you hear very frequently. Now, I think it's worth pointing out a couple of things. One is that these changes described here in women's lives were the outcome of the choices made by others, of course, not by themselves. And second, of course, that the word backbone suggests, on the one hand, something that carries the weight of an entire body or community or organization, but also something which is not in the forefront, something that is in the background. And that's what they mean by it was a woman shouldering everything. So this huge weight placed on women's shoulders, I was told, ultimately translated into a sense of empowerment. Women realized that they could indeed carry such weight and get on with their lives without a man. So this understanding of empowerment as inner strength, another very common expression, is by no means unusual. In fact, as I'm going to discuss briefly in the second part of the paper, this is often the sense in which the word empowerment is used in very different contexts today, like, as I mentioned, self-help groups, yoga classes, in the area of developmental studies, and in feminism as well. So the world seems to be in love with this word, which is hardly ever questioned because, as the sociologist Anne Calves puts it, empowerment is one of the vague, resolutely optimistic and just terms which, like poverty alleviation, can only bring about consensus. Who would ever argue that poverty alleviation is a good thing? So, to start with, I will try to give you an idea of the frequency with which the word empowerment seems to be used today in academia alone, by pointing out that a Google Scholar search resulted in over 1.5 million entries on the word empowerment alone. So the omnipresence of this word is so evident that we sometimes forget about it or tend to overlook it. And again, Calves notices that the infatuation with empowerment in the English-speaking world appears boundless, to the point, in fact, that she records in 1997, a book was published on self-empowerment for dogs. So, I think it's important to keep in mind that dogs, lovely creatures as they are not likely to change the world. That's something that I will keep in mind there. So it's my persuasion that the empowerment discourse as currently used is, first of all, full of implications that may not be immediately evident, and second, and possibly also the product of a guilty conscience. So in her analysis of the history of the notion of empowerment, Calves argues that the roots of the notion can be traced back to such diverse sources of inspiration as feminism, Freudian psychology, the Black Power movement, and Gandhism. The notion of empowerment, however, only became popular in academia and in social service providers in the 70s, when it started to be used consistently to refer to what you may call marginalized or oppressed groups. So the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, African Americans, etc. What I think is more interesting here, however, is the association that this early use of the word has with the pedagogy of the oppressed, outlined by pedagogist and philosopher Paulo Freire in the book under the same title, published in '68. So Freire's pedagogic approach starts from the assumption that in every society the domination of the masses by a small number of people results in what he calls a dominated consciousness. So if we look, for example, to colonial or post-colonial societies, we may talk of the colonized mind. If we look at slavery in the US, we can think about one of the several speeches by Malcolm X in which he marks the difference between what was then known as the house Negro and the field Negro. Field Negro, which is embodied wonderfully by Samuel L. Jackson in Django Unchained. But apart from that, so Freire's approach aimed to overcome what he called dominated consciousness and attained what he called critical consciousness. So through an active teaching method, the educator helps the individual become aware of his own situation, of himself or herself as a subject, so that he or she may obtain the instrument that would allow him or her to make choices and become politically conscious. So for Freire, the role of the educator is not simply to transmit knowledge to the student, but to seek alongside the student the means to transform the world that surrounds him. That's crucial, the transformation part. So his pedagogy was aimed not at raising consciousness as a critical, as an exercise in contemplative self-awareness, but as a step in a process that begins with understanding or awareness and eventually leads to acting and changing. So the goal for oppressed people was not only to feel stronger and express themselves, but also to gain power to overcome their situation or their oppression. So the reference to Paulo Freire would probably make many Republicans happy because, as you probably know, Paulo Freire is one of the authors whose work tends to be cited alongside the likes of Che Guevara as part of the self-education classes in the non-cash back in the day. However, I'm not entirely sure that the use of the word today would make Freire or indeed the Black movement, the Black Power people very happy. So criticisms of the current use of the word empowerment or the empowerment discourse is not infrequent. Calves herself criticizes what she calls the domestication of the concept and the shift from a focus on individual and collective dimensions of power to a totally individualistic understanding of power. So in this sense, empowerment has become, as she puts it, synonymous with individual capacity, realization, and status. We have moved, she suggests, from liberating empowerment to liberal empowerment. So in the process of going mainstream, the notion has lost at least some of its subversive potential. Now, in some of the circles in which the word is used today, I would argue that transformative potential is lost entirely. So if you look at the area of counseling and self-help, for example, the word refers almost exclusively to a sort of deep looking into oneself, to accept and or possibly change oneself, but certainly not to change the circumstances. And in other circles, for example, in feminist circles in and outside academia, the transformative meaning of the word seems to have lost at least part of its potential. So Calves again notices that the words women's empowerment have often taken the place of gender equality. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing. So the idea that empowerment is a tool for a radical questioning and ultimately overthrowing of structural inequalities seems to have been lost to a great extent, and it's become a tool for self-help in many ways, and some would say for self-blinding occasionally as well. In association with this, I think there's an excessive and ultimately unethical glorification of the notion of agency. So every choice, no matter how limited the options may be in the first place, is praised and celebrated as a sign of agency. And this de facto tends to obliterate all that is wrong in the social world to start with, and the structural inequalities that may exist behind people's choices. So the risk is, and I haven't been able to look into this in any depth yet, but the risk is for anthropology, feminism, and maybe particularly for feminist anthropology, that the notion of empowerment and the glorification of agency end up being a sort of a life vest to make up or perhaps hide the errors of the past. So from a guilty sort of colonial, post-colonial past in which the white middle-class female anthropologists went into the field and pointed out to the natives, to the native women, how oppressed they were, and unaware of it to boot, we now have a situation in which the same academic, of a middle class, possibly white, can go into the field and doesn't actually have to bother with oppression in the first place, as long as she can feel and therefore argue in writing that native women are empowered because, and then fill up the space. So, incidentally, by the way, the use of the verb to feel as a substitute for to think has a similar function today of depoliticizing everything and hampering any real discussion on conditions of inequality. Because today you're not being oppressed necessarily, you feel that you're being oppressed. So, the fact that there are undoubtedly instances, and my research is one of these, in which the research subjects themselves make use of the word empowerment or of concepts that can be placed under that umbrella, makes it obviously unethical and wrong on every level to deny that sense of self-empowerment. It is, however, relevant, I think, to point out that some of the implications of this notion, as it is used in this particular scenario, and as should hopefully be clear to this point, at this point, I think that the idea of empowerment that underlies these narratives is not entirely dissimilar to what I've been indicating as the current mainstream interpretation of the word. So, if we return to the different terms that I have attempted to analyze here, what we find is that independence tend to indicate self-sufficiency, so again, a woman shouldering everything, not necessarily associated with a demand for rights. Empowerment has to do with gaining awareness of one's own strength, and again, not necessarily with the power to modify the circumstances around us. Sense of responsibility, seen as being aware of others and caring for others, seems to be expected exclusively of women, and there's an idea that sense of responsibility is a natural female trait, in this sense of caring for. And precisely because sense of responsibility is seen as natural in women, agency appears to be reduced in a way to that falling into the pattern that I talked about previously, as if this pattern wasn't a cultural one in the first place. So the empowerment discourse as is currently used in our contemporary world was, of course, unlikely to leave Belfast untouched. As we know, mainstream discourses have the power to shape societal life, both in material and in symbolic terms. So as this includes, of course, shaping the social agent's own views. As Bourdieu reminds us, although the field of symbolic, meaning discursive production, is autonomous, it is dominated in its functioning by the constraints that dominate the social field. So the classes and or social groupings endowed with the greatest material power are also in a position to create discourses that matter. And so he argues that objective power relations tend to reproduce themselves in symbolic power relations, in views of the social world that help to ensure the permanence of these power relations. So the social groupings instead that occupy the dominated position within the social space are also located in dominated positions in the field of symbolic production or discourse production. So crucial here, I think, is the idea that mainstream views of the social world tend to ensure the permanence of the power relations that exist in the social world in the first place. So where does this leave us in terms of women in West Belfast? So while there's a general agreement in the literature that the Troubles and the opposing nationalisms in Northern Ireland effectively hampered the creation of a strong feminist movement in the region, the impact of the empowerment discourse on women's self-image has not been studied, at least not to my knowledge. So I'm not sure that we shall actually conclude that from these tentative reflections that empowerment has become a concept in the service of the status quo. That's a bit of a strong way to put it. But I think there's evidently a sense in which the discourse or rhetoric of empowerment tends to shift our attention from equality, generally, or gender equality, and women's rights to things like inner strength and the agent's awareness of it. So it's all about the individual and how he or she feels about herself or himself. So in a sense, we tend to forget the demands for rights and social change, as well as the root causes of inequality, which, by the way, are what makes it necessary to empower oppressed groups in the first place. So if we look at the famous slogan, a woman's place is in the struggle, which has been used by struggles all over the world, I suppose that the question would be, which struggle is that? So is that the struggle for a united Ireland, as in this case? Is it the struggle for self-empowerment? Or is it the struggle for gender equality? Thank you.